Gemara on Yud Aleph on the base, 11b in the art scroll, it's 11b2, and the Gemara was discussing regarding lulav. Morning, Adam. The Gemara was discussing regarding lulav. Does lulav need to be tied? Do you have to tie the hadassim and the aravot to the lulav, which means eget? Do you have to actually tie it together, or you don't have to tie it together? So the Gemara originally was suggesting that there's a machlokes tanoim. There's a machlokes of the tanoim of the early rabbis regarding. Remember, we had the issue of if you made something a certain way. Let's say you made the sukkah, you placed the schach on top of the sukkah, and after you placed the schach on top of the sukkah, you placed it while it was attached to the ground, which we said that's not kosher, because the schach has to be detached from the ground. But you had placed it while it was attached to the ground, and then subsequently you had cut it. Well, you didn't move the schach around. You just cut the schach. You had detached it from its attachment. So the Gemara brought a machlokas of Amoraim, whether is that considered good enough by the fact that you cut it, or do you have to do more of an action? You have to go ahead and actually replace it or move it around on the top of the sukkah. Because there is a halacha that the sukkah has to be made in a kosher way. It can't be made in an invalid way. And since you placed it on while it was attached to the ground, that was made invalid. So now you have to make it in a kosher fashion. So the question is cutting it considered enough of making it, or you have to actually move it? That was two opinions in the Gemara. And the halach is you have to actually move every piece, or else if you don't move every piece, it's considered that it was made in an invalid way, and it was never made in a kosher way. The fact that at the end of the day you cut it, but it still was made in an invalid way. Good morning, Mr. Vitesh. So the Gemara brought a case of a hadassim, that you had hadassim, and there was berries on the hadassim, and there was the majority of the hadassim of the myrtle branch was filled with there was more berries than leaves. And we said berries, if there's too many berries on the hadassim, it will invalidate the hadass. It wouldn't be kosher because it's not beautiful, but it has all these berries that are part of this hadass. The beauty of the hadassim is the beautiful green leaves. So the Gemara brought a machlokas. If cutting the berries, would that be sufficient, or that would not be sufficient? And the Gemara understood you had tied the hadassim to the arav. You tied the hadassim and the aravot to the. Good morning, Jaime.
Morning.
Morning. You had tied the hadassim and the aravot to the lulav. We are on Yud Aleph on the base. We are on 11b2 in the art scroll. We were in the middle of the Gemara when we had the two opinions. If you tied hadassim and the aravot to the lulav while the berries were on the hadass, you did not cut the berries off before you tied it. So you tied it in a way where it's not kosher, where the Gemara is understanding that it's not kosher, because the Gemara is understanding that you need to tie the hadassim and the aravot to the lulav, and you have to do that in a kosher fashion. And since you tied it in a not kosher fashion, because it was the berries were on when you tied it, it's an invalid process, invalid making of the hadassim and the aravot and the lulav. And the fact that you cut the berries off afterwards, and we see there's a machloket. One opinion says that's good enough. One opinion says that's not good enough. So the Gemara wanted to compare that argument to the argument of the sukkah by cutting the vine that was attached to that we had to place on the sukkah while it was attached. If cutting the vine is good enough, if cutting the berries off is good enough, so then cutting the vine is also good enough. If cutting the berries is not good enough, the cutting the vine is not good enough. That's how the Gemara was comparing the two. That's what we were up to in the Gemara. So the Gemara is going to show us that it's not a compelling point to say that the story of the lulav is comparable to the story of the sukkah. And the Gemara wanted to bring the Hadassim case as a precedent to show us that we found early rabbis arguing in the similar argument that we had by the sukkah. That's what the Gemara wanted to show us. That was the Gemara's attempt to say that the argument between Rav and Shmuel, if cutting the vine is sufficient, or let's say the similar story about the tzitzit, if you made the tzitzit when it was one string, and then you snip the end at the end, if you snip the tip, is that good enough or not? The Gemara wanted to say that we found early rabbis also arguing in the same thing. What the Gemara is going to be doing today is to show us that it's not clear that the early rabbis are actually arguing in that case. And therefore you can't bring that as a show of support for any opinion. I mean, the Gemara had the opinion of Rav. Rav said that snipping the ends of the tzitzit is enough at the end, even though you made the tzitzit with one string. Rav says it's enough to cut the vine that was, even though it was placed on while it was attached. Rav says it's enough just to cut it. You don't have to do anything more. You don't have to replace it. You don't have to move the schach. And the Gemara wanted to say we found an early rabbi that agrees with Rav and an early rabbi that agrees with Shmuel. And where the Gemara is going to go is the Gemara is going to want to show that there's no support for Rav's opinion. There's no support for Rav's opinion that just cutting it at the end is sufficient. So now, how does the Gemara get to that? So how is the Gemara going to explain the allowance, the opinion by Lulav, right? Because we found two opinions by Lulav. We found the Chachamim. The Chachamim said that if the guy cut the berries after he had tied the Hadassim and the Haravot to the Lulav, so he made the Lulav, and so to speak, in a not kosher fashion. He processed it like making tzitzit, not in a kosher fashion. You tied it in not a kosher fashion, and yet it's just good enough just to cut the berry off. You hear that, Mr. Haber? So that's what the Gemara wanted to. So we're gonna go to that, back to that point, and we're gonna run through the Gemara. The Gemara lema ketanai. Let us say this is the bottom of 11. Go back to 11b1, just the bottom, the last few lines of the page, 11b1, because we're in the middle of this Gemara. Lema ketanai. Let us say the argument of Rav and Shmuel is a similar argument of early rabbis. What's the case? The Gemara says, Ova veliktan. If you went ahead and you violated, because you were not supposed to cut those berries off on Yom Tov, and you went ahead and you cut those berries off on Yom Tov from the Hadass after you had tied it to the Lulav, pasul. So the first opinion says it's pasul, it's invalid. Now, divrei Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yotzadak. The Chachamim Mashirim. The Chachamim say that it is kosher, that once you cut the berries off, the Hadass is able to be kosher, and you could use it for your lulav. Now, people need to remember that the four species, the Hadassim and the Ravot, if you don't have proper Hadassim, the whole thing is no good. You could have the most expensive etrog. You could pay $500 or whatever people pay for expensive etrog. If the Hadassim are no good, or the Ravot are no good, it's no good. The whole thing is no good. So sometimes people have the most beautiful etrog and they're not careful about. Usually the Hadassim have good, long shelf life. But the Aravot, you're also supposed to beautify the mitzvah with the Aravot, and the willows, a lot of times they dry up. I mean, usually it still will be kosher, because usually it doesn't get to the level of such dryness, but definitely to beautify the lulav, it's nice to have nice aravot. So here Chacham say it's kosher. Once you cut those berries off from the hadassim, it's kosher. Savrua de kuliyama. So the Bnei Yeshiva thought lulav sarich again. They thought, because this is a matter of dispute, do you have to tie the aravot and the hadassim to the lulav, or they do not need that to be tied? You know, we connect it somehow. Either you tie it, or you have this holder that you place the hadassim and the aravot in, and you have the lulav inside that. So you have it all together. So is there an obligation to actually tie the haravot and the hadassim to the lulav? So Savrua, the Bnei Yeshiva, thought that everybody holds you need to go ahead and tie the haravot and hadassim to the lulav. V'alfinan lulav mesukkah. Now we're on 11b2. Turn the page. And we learn lulav from Sukkah. And what do you learn by lulav from Sukkah? Tiksiv gabe Sukkah. Ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. By Sukkah, it says you have to make it in a kosher fashion, not something that was made in a not kosher fashion and then somehow it became kosher without an action of yours. Like we said, the case of the haystack. If you went ahead and you right. So the Gemara. So the Gemara. Let's say the pasuk says, "Chag hasukot ta'aseh." The sukkah you shall make. So the Gemara's understanding is that you have to do an action that when you make that sukkah, when you make the schach, your action made it a sukkah. Your action made it viable, usable for a sukkah. But if you went ahead and you, let's say, you piled up a pile of hay, and then so there's a full pile of hay, and it said, and then so therefore when you and there's a ceiling of hay, but it was not made. Your action did not make a kosher. It's not kosher for sach because it's a whole pile of hay, and then you dug out the middle of the pile, and now you're left with the top. Now you have a proper ceiling, a proper schach. You have the hay as the schach. But the making of that, when that ceiling was made, it was not made in a kosher fashion. So the Gemara's understanding is it doesn't say a sukkah shall be made. It doesn't say, that's the point, Dr. Navid. It doesn't say that it's not just the bottom line. In America, a lot of people are on the bottom line. What's the bottom line? Do you have a sukkah? You don't have a sukkah. It's not, the Torah doesn't say, sukkah you shall have. The sukkah you shall make. The sukkah, which represents, let's say, the schach of the sukkah, you need to do that action to make that kosher part of the sukkah. You have to make it. But if the fact that it is made, the fact that you dug down on that haystack and you cut out, or that igloo, you cut out that bottom, that like an igloo, you cut out that bottom, and now you're left with that cover, but you didn't make that schach, that top of the haystack in a way of kosher. You didn't do that. It became kosher. It became a sukkah. It's not enough to become a sukkah. You rather have to go ahead and what? Make it a kosher sukkah. Just like the story with the vine. When you placed the vine while it was attached to the ground on top of the sukkah, you didn't make it a kosher. At that time, you didn't make a kosher sukkah. Torah says, I want you to make a kosher sukkah. But the Torah says, I want you to make a sukkah. What type of sukkah is the Torah talking about? I want you to make a kosher sukkah. I want you to place a schach. I want you to make a proper cover for the sukkah. If you did not make, that's how I want you to do it. So the Gemara's understanding. So the Gemara says we found this by Sukkah, and the Gemara also said we have this drasha by tzitzit. You have to make the tzitzit, or gedilim tasher lacha, v'osulem tzitzit. You have to make it. So the Gemara understand you have to make it in a kosher fashion. You're making it. But if it just becomes tzitzit, but you didn't make it in the kosher, you didn't do it. It wasn't your action that made it kosher. It's just some other action that happened that it became tzitzit. You snipped it at the end, but when you made it, you didn't make kosher tzitzit. So that's not called making the tzitzit. By snipping, if you made the tzitzit with one string, that's not kosher. You didn't make it in a kosher fashion, and it's not kosher.
But well, for him, it looks like a perfect.
Right? He doesn't know. That's true. That's it looks beautiful. It's just like a mezuzah. If it wasn't written lishma or a sefer Torah, the fact that it looks kosher, it's not kosher. So it's tzitzit that was not made. It looks kosher, but you can't tell. It's not kosher. It needs the proper the way it was done.
The person that's in the homemade in your house is built and puts it on and has the right kabbalah.
Doesn't make a difference. If it's not made in a kosher fashion, you can have a beautiful sukkah, but if it's not made in a kosher, if it wasn't made right, according to this opinion, if you have a beautiful sukkah, everything is detached. But when it was made when the vine originally was attached to the attached, and you placed it on top of the sukkah. They haven't filled the mitzvah. Correct. So the Gemara says, "V'alfina lulav misukkah." The Gemara's understanding, Dr. Nevitz, that's what the Gemara is saying, that we should learn lulav from sukkah. That just like sukkah has to be made in a kosher fashion, the lulav also has to be made in a kosher fashion. And if it was made and it's not kosher because the berries were still on the hadassim, so it's not you're not saying even if later on you cut the berries, but it wasn't made in a kosher fashion. So the Gemara says, "My love," and everyone hold that you learn lulav for sukkah. The ksiv gabe sukkah tasev v'lo min asur. It has to be made in a kosher fashion. So my love, so what's the argument over here by the hadassim? The man the machshir, the one who says that it's kosher if you cut the berries off later. We say by sukkah, when you cut at the end, when you cut the vine at the end, that's as if you made it. We look at it, that's not just after the fact. We consider it as if that's part and parcel of making it. By cutting off the berries, we look at it as if you're making it. You're doing an action in more close in the hadas. It's as if you made the hadas now. Uman de pasil sava, and the one that says it's pasul, he holds lower mina gabe sukkah kisitatan hisiyatan. We don't say by sukkah just cutting it is good enough. It's as if you're making it now. By lulav, we also don't say that just cutting off the berries is as if you made it now. So the Gemara says, look. The Gemara says, you cannot use this as a support to find that there's a precedent, that there's a rabbi on record that says that if it was made in a not kosher fashion, just cutting at the end is good enough. You would have to technically re-untie it and tie it, and on Yom Tov you can't untie the knot, tie the knot. So what's the dispute over here by the berries on the hadashim? Everybody, we see the Gemara is definitely leaning to the idea that cutting at the end, the schach, once it was placed, when it was detached, when it was attached, it was a place attached to the vine, cutting it is not good enough. You would have to replace it. We don't look at cutting it now, that's making it. It's not, you still, at the end of the day, you placed it when it was attached to the ground. The rule of the question is, if you cut the berries, is that like you making it? Do we look at it like you made that, as if you made it now? the cutting of the berries.
But we, last week, no, doesn't have to cut it off. Not,
So
then,
is that called making it now?
no, I thought making it down.
Tied together would be definitely, that's the way it's, the ideal way it's supposed to be made. Is to tie it with a hadass that's kosher, that the berries are off. Meaning that what was the guy supposed to do? Before Yom Tov, he was supposed to cut off the berries of the hadassah. And then tie it, subsequently tie it. He didn't do that. He left the berries on and he tied it with the berries on. And now the question is, by cutting off the berries, is that good enough? Or you have to do more than that? Now on Yom Tov, he's going to be stuck. He cannot, maybe for Chalamoid, he can untie it and retie it. But in Yom Tov itself, he can't untie and tie. But now the question is that action of cutting, do we look at it like, you know what? It's like he made it in a kosher fashion or not? So the Gemara says, look, the Kuli Alma, Lo Amina Gabi Sukkah Ksitatan Zuasiyasa. Everybody holds by Sukkah, we do not say the cutting is like you made it. Cutting is not good enough. Cutting the vine after it was placed on, not properly. The argument is, can we learn lulav from Sukkah or not? Meaning to say, the one who says that it is kosher by the berries, case of adasim, sava, lo yalfinan lulav me Sukkah. We don't learn lulav from Sukkah. That means to say, Sukkah has a special halacha that when you place the schach on the Sukkah, that has to be placed in a kosher fashion. However, we do not say that the tying has to be also done in the kosher fashion. As long as at the end of the day, you have hadassim and aravot and lulav together, they're tied together, even though it was not made originally in a kosher fashion, that's good enough. So that's what the Gemara says. Now, Ibayit Ema. Now the Gemara suggests another answer. Isviralan, lulav sarach aged, in one area. If we hold that lulav needs to be tied, if we hold that you have to tie the hadassim and the aravot to the lulav, huli almo obligi the alfina lulav misukah, then you would learn lulav from sukkah that it has to be made properly. It would have to be made originally when you make it. You would have to make it just like when you make a sukkah, you have to make it properly. And the tzitzit you have to make properly. So too, it's not just about the end product. It's about the process, doing it right. But so what's the issue here? This is where they're arguing. Masava sarach eged. One rabbi holds you have to tie it together. And because you have to tie it together, so since it was tied together not properly, it's not kosher. Umasava, the rabbi who holds that it is kosher, even though you tied it with the berries on the hadassim, he holds ein sarach eged. He holds you do not need to tie the aravot and the hadassim to the lulav. And since you don't need to tie it, so there's no problem. There's no problem that it was tied with the berries on, because you don't need to tie it at all. And therefore, if you subsequently cut the berries off, it is kosher. Uplukta dehani tanoi. And it's the argument of the following tanoim. The Gemara now says that this concept of whether you need to tie the hadassim and the aravot to the lulav is a matter of dispute. But the Tanya is an early Braita, it's early rabbis. The Tanya is a Braita. The Gemara usually brings a Braita as an explanation of a Mishnah or as a support for a certain halacha. So the Tanya is a very powerful source. Because in the Gemara, the earlier the source, more powerful it is. The earlier the rabbis. So therefore, bring a Braita. If you have late rabbis, if you have a late rabbi, like let's pull an Amoraim, you have him making a statement, you could refute him from the early rabbi. If you find an early rabbi, a Braita that says differently, it will be knockout. Generally, it would be a knockout. It would knock out the later rabbi, because the later rabbi will not have the shoulders to go against the early rabbi. So they only have shoulders to go against their colleagues and their generation. There's considered different time periods. So just like today, a rabbi today would not want to argue on a Rishon. Rabbis today would not want to argue on someone from 500 years ago. They don't feel that they're in the position to argue. They can maybe argue someone from 100 years ago. If they feel differently. Moshe Feinstein can argue on someone from 100 years, but he's not going to argue on someone from 500-600 years ago. Generally, that's not usually that you argue the Achronim would not argue on the Rishonim. So that's what the Gemara says over here. So the Gemara says this concept of whether you have to tie the Hadassim and the Aravot to the Lulav is a matter of dispute. So the Gemara says, where is the Machloket? Plukta Dehani Tanai. The Tanya, we learned in the Braita, Lulav, bein a good, bein ain't a good kosher. If you have a Lulav, whether the species, you have Hadassim and Aravot, and whether they are tied together to the Lulav or not tied together, we welcome Mr. Silverman. It says what? Kosher. The Lulav is kosher. Because this opinion holds, it does not need to be what? Tied together. You could, the same way you have the etrog separate from the lulav, you could have the hadassim and the ravot also separate. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says a good kosher. Rabbi Yehuda says if it is a good, if it is tied, it is kosher. She'ena a good, but if it's not tied, then it is pasul. So Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that it has to be tied, that you must tie the hadassim and the aravot to the lulav. Now, so the Gemara says, "My time with Rabbi Yehuda." What is the reason for Rabbi Yehuda? Where does Rabbi Yehuda get a source that you have to tie the hadassim and the aravot to the lulav? The Torah says you should take kachtem lachem b'yom harishon. The Torah says you should take for yourself a pri hadar, take an etrog. It says you should also take kapot tumarim. You should take from the date tree. You take the hadassim. It says you take the kapot tumarim, the lulav. Take the lulav. And it says v'anaf eitzavot, and it says you take the myrtle, you take the hadassim, and it says arvei nachal, it says you take the willows. So the pasuk just says you take the etrog, and you take the other items. So where do we see that it has to be tied together? So the Gemara says yalif lekicha me'agudat ezov. The Torah says that, by the Jewish people, what did they have to do before they left Egypt? They slaughtered the Korban Pesach, and they took a bundle of hyssop. Hyssop is a grass. And the Torah says, I want you to take a bundle of hyssop, l'kachtem agudat ezov, take a bundle of hyssop, and you dip it in the blood, and of the blood of the Korban Pesach, and you put it on the doorposts. Right? And all the Jewish homes that had the merit, they had the zchut of the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, they slaughtered the avodah zarah of the Egyptians, which was once their avodah zarah, that the Jewish people had fallen very low in worshiping the sheep of Egypt. They worshiped avodah zarah. So in the merit that they should be saved, that Hashem should skip over their houses, they went ahead and they slaughtered the Korban Pesach. They slaughtered that, and they took this hyssop, bundle of hyssop grass, and they went ahead and they dipped it into the what? into the blood of the Korban Pesach, and they put it on the doorpost. A bundle, by the way, the Gemara later on says if you have three should be a bundle, right? How many grass needs to be a bundle? We'll see in the Gemara later on. Let's say three for sure should be a bundle. Now, bundle is usually when it's tied together. Bundle, when something is a bundle, it's not. If you don't tie something together, it's not really considered. Maybe it's called a heap. If you're not tying something to pile, it's not a bundle. So if you in the Torah says I want a bundle, it says ulakachtem. I want you to take for yourself and a bundle of hyssop. So the same way over there, it's tied together, and it uses the same word by lulav, ulakachtem. So it says lakachtem over there, and it says lakachtem over here. So Rabbi Yehuda understands that mal halan ba'agudah. By the way, there's an organization called Agudat Yisrael. Agudat Yisrael. That's the idea of being joined together, tied together. That means Jewish people tied together. So mal halan ba'agudah, just like over there, the hyssop was tied together. A bundle afkan ba'agudah. So too over here, when the Torah tells us that you have to go ahead and take the lulav, so that also has to be bundled together. So the Gemara says, but the Rabbanan hold l'kicha lo yafina. We do not learn this gzeira shaveh. They don't have the fact that it says the same word here and the same word there doesn't necessarily mean that the law that applies there applies here. You need to have a Mesorah. You need to have a tradition from your teachers, from Moshe and Sinai, that the Torah, when the Torah uses the same word in two different places, that's called a Gzeira Shaveh. That's one of the 13 ways the Torah is expounded upon. When it has, we know Kal V'chomer, so this is one of them. What do you say, Simon? Right, there's a Gzeira Shaveh, says the same word in two different places. But you need to have a tradition to say that the same word here is also applied, that the law that applies here, when it has this word, applies over here. The rabbis don't have such a tradition. This other rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda, had that from he understands that, but rabbis don't have that tradition. I just want to show support for why not to have that, is because when the Torah says lakachtem by lulav and etrog, it says lakachtem lachem bayom harishon pri etzadah. The etrog, it opens up the pasuk by take an etrog and the other three species. No one holds you have to tie the etrog to anything, right? There's no question of tying the etrog. The question is you have to tie the hadassim and the ravo to the lulav, and the source is from lakachtem that you should take, but you're taking. But the taking of the Torah is not just talking about the lulav and hadassim and ravot. It's talking about even on the etrog, and we know you don't tie the etrog to anything. So I just wanted to say that would lend itself a little bit, that it's that lakachtem, when it says you shall take over here, it does not refer to the tying, the bundling of the hadassim and the ravot. There is a very famous Tosfot. Yes. It says lakachta. It says the same word. It says it talks about a bundle by the blood. It says you shall take. To take a bundle of. No, he has that tradition. He has that tradition that when it says lakachtem by lulav, it also has to be tied together. The same way you have to tie the hyssop together. Take a bundle of hyssop. No. He is a Tana. Rabbi Yehuda is in the league of Tana. He's one of, because Rabbana don't have such a teaching. They don't have the teaching that the fact that it says lakachtem here and lakachtem there, what applies there applies here. They don't have same time. Rabbana as Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbanan over here, when it says Rabbanan, it's referring to the Rabbanan of that generation, of that time period. But the Gemara says, Kaman Ozla. And by the way, there's a famous, Tosfos points out, there is a famous lakicha that we do compare. What are we referring to? Marriage. The Gemara says, how do you know that you could betroth a woman by giving her money? Right? One of the ways, the Mishnah says in Kedushin, there are three ways, Gemara Boaz, that you could affect a marriage, to create a marriage, to get married. And one of the three things is by giving money or the value of money. And the Gemara says, how do you know that you could betroth a woman with money? So the Gemara says, because the pasuk says, Ki yikach ish isha, it says by marriage, when you take a woman, how do you take a woman? How do you get married to a woman? So it says Ki yikach, and we have the same word Ki yikach, the language of kicha, when it refers to Sedei Ephron, when it refers to when Avraham bought the Ma'arat HaMachpelah, when he bought the place for burial for Sarah, it also said Nasati Kesav Asad Kach Mimeni. He uses the word of, when they was referring to money, and he uses the word of kicha, of taking. So the Gemara says there is a famous Gezerah Shaveh, that just like over there, when it refers to Avraham buying the plot, it was called kicha. The word kicha was referring to money. So too over here, by marriage, it also should be. It's also the kicha. The kicha of marriage is also through money. That's one of the ways you could marry a woman. There's other ways also that could affect the marriage. No, there's other. You could marry a woman with a shtar. If you would, we don't do that by writing a document. Say, I want you to marry me with this shtar. This document is going to create the marriage. We give a ketuvah. Ketuvah is not. It's the responsibilities of the husband to the wife, but that's not making the marriage. What made the marriage is the giving of the ring. When he go ahead and he betrothed her, and he says, "Harayat mukudeshet li." Our custom today, the tabazu or whatever the minhag is, or whatever you give, that creates the marriage. What do they do today? By some of the Sfardim, they give kesef, they give a coin. Some of them give coins, right? Is there some people have that? What's the custom in the community? What they use a ring to betroth? Some people use some other form. What? No, but that's an engage that we're talking about the betrothal ring. There's something called the special marriage ring. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Kaman azla." Who is this following braita? Hodatanya lulav mitzvah lagdo. The lulav, there's a mitzvah to tie the lulav with the hadassim and their ravot. Now we're turning to the next page. We're on the move. 11b3. Who is the imlo agdao? But if you did not tie it, kosher. So we say lulav, there's a mitzvah to tie the lulav, but if you did not tie it, it is kosher. You hear that? It's very interesting. It's something it's ideally you should do it, but if you don't do it, it's still kosher. Rabbi Yehuda, if it's Rabbi Yehuda, kilo agdo my kosher. Rabbi Yehuda said you must tie it. So why is it if you didn't tie it, it's kosher? Rabbi Yehuda says you must tie it. And if it's the Rabbanan, amay mitzvah. If it's the Rabbanan, why is there a mitzvah to tie it if you don't have to tie it? The Gemara's going to say, we'll see it more tomorrow, even if there's still a mitzvah, even if you don't need to tie it, because the mitzvah does not obligate you to tie it, but there's a separate concept of beautifying the lulav and the mitzvah. And the way you beautify it, one way to beautify it is by tying it together. I want to wish everyone a great day. We should all be tied together in good things. All the best.
Man.
Take care. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Silverman, thank you for joining. Have a great day. Take care, Mr. Haven.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a